Today, we're going to look at voting, in particular the question of whether there is a moral obligation to vote. Many people think that there is such an obligation, that it's some sort of moral failing for a citizen of democracy to abstain from voting. In this video, we'll examine some of the arguments for and against this. I should note that Jason Brennan's book, The Ethics of Voting, is a good source for more detail on many of the arguments discussed here, and it's not too technical, so it's worth reading if you're interested in the topic. Now, we're going to assume throughout this video that we're dealing with citizens in a reasonably well-functioning democracy. So the voting system is fair and is not rigged, the government is not totally corrupt. Obviously all countries have problems, nowhere is perfect, but just look at countries like the UK, Canada, Norway as being representative examples here. These countries have pretty much free and fair elections. So in countries like these, is there a duty to vote? Well, there are two simple arguments for a duty to vote that are noted by Brennan, which appeal to the instrumental value of voting. So first there's the prudence argument, which says you ought to promote your own interests. Your vote, when cast correctly, will promote your own interests, so you ought to vote. And the beneficence argument, you ought to promote the common good. Your vote, when cast correctly, will promote the common good, so you ought to vote. The thought is it makes a big difference to the good of yourself and to the good of the country which party wins the election. Your vote helps to determine the outcome of the election, so you should vote. Now, the trouble here is that, as many writers on the literature of voting have pointed out, the second premise of both of these arguments seems to be false. So, yes, it's true that the benefit of your favoured candidate winning is very great, and of course the cost of voting is very small, but the probability that your vote will be pivotal to the outcome of the election, the probability that your vote will make a difference to the outcome, is vanishingly small. It's as close to difference, it's as close to zero as makes no difference. So your vote is pivotal when the candidate wins by one vote. If your favoured candidate wins by one vote, then you can truly say that had you not voted, she would not have won. And so in that situation, your vote makes a difference. It determines the outcome of the election. But obviously that hardly ever happens. Your vote almost certainly won't make any difference. The outcome will be the same whether or not you vote. So can we say anything in defence of these two arguments? Well, there are numerous ways we might try to show that voting is of instrumental value, that voting is a way of promoting the common good or promoting your interests. First of all, Brennan and Lemaski in the article "Is There a Duty to Vote?" note that so Derek Parfit grants that this point undermines the prudence argument, but says that actually the beneficence argument still stands. Parfit argues that if I'm considering how an act affects one person or a few people, then yeah, it's unreasonable to consider tiny chances. I need not worry about a 1 in a million chance of killing myself, let's say. Similarly, then, it would be irrational to vote purely out of self-interest because there's such a tiny chance of my vote actually helping me. It would be a better use of my time to just stay in and eat donuts or something. However, when a potential action affects a very large group of people, tiny chances matter. Consider a nuclear engineer worrying about a 1 in a million chance of killing 1 million people. Here, the stakes are so high, that it affects such a large group of people that we should consider these events that have tiny chances of happening. Similarly, in an election, the stakes are high, and it affects literally everybody living in the country. The right party winning would be a great social benefit over the wrong party winning, so it's worth taking the time to vote, despite the minuscule chance of it making a difference. Voting comes at very little cost to yourself, and there's a tiny chance of making a big difference to lots of people in the country. So Brennan and Lemaski object to this kind of response. They say, well, look, the nuclear engineer is... it's kind of an easy case, right? Like, of course it's worthwhile to, expend 15 minutes in order to avert something that has a 1 in a million chance of killing 1 million people. Because there's no question at all that a nuclear accident with 1 million casualties would be a spectacularly bad outcome. Obviously, a nuclear accident with 1 million casualties is a far, far worse outcome than than no nuclear accident, right? So here we have two clear, well-defined options where one is obviously worse than the other. You know, there's no nuclear accident, which is fine, and there's a nuclear accident killing 1 million people, which is absolutely catastrophic. Voting in elections, Brennan and Lemaski say, isn't really comparable. In most elections, the outcomes are not so well defined, and one outcome isn't obviously significantly worse than the other. First, the alternative party isn't generally disastrous. The alternative party isn't substantially worse than your favoured party. Political parties generally just aren't so different from each other. I mean, for one thing, in a democratic system, no major party can locate itself too far from the preferences of the median voter. So, you know, we can be pretty sure that, yeah, things might get a bit worse, but society isn't going to collapse if the rival party wins. Second, we should recognise that our judgments of the competing party platforms are highly fallible. Pretty much everybody agrees that a nuclear accident would be a bad thing. But there's a lot of debate about whether, for example, Labour or Conservative will be best for the country. And there are intelligent people on either side. So we should recognise, you know, some of our judgments here might be wrong, right? You know, we can recognise that there are intelligent people who sort of hold very different views to us. You know, it's something that's open to debate, and we should recognise that we're all kind of fallible and that we might be wrong about the views that we hold. Third, politicians never keep all of their promises anyway. So they might support a particular platform, but will just be unable to enact all of it. Yes, it would be an enormous benefit if, I don't know, like let's say, you know, if we institute universal healthcare or avoid a potential war or something, right? But then things go wrong, and it might turn out not to be so easy. There are all kinds of historical accidents and surprises, unpredictable wars, assassinations, economic crashes, mental decline of the winning candidate, and so on. So even if you knew with certainty that platform A would be far better than platform B, the sort of expected benefit of your vote for A is lower just because you don't know whether that platform is going to be enacted fully. So anyway, all of these three factors end up, you know, decreasing the expected benefit, the expected utility of your vote. So Brennan and Lemaski say, well, look, maybe there are these specific conditions under which you have a duty to vote. We might be able to say, you know, if you are a very reliable judge of the party platforms, if you have very good reason to think that one platform would be substantially worse for the country as a whole than another, so the stakes are very high, if the election is close enough that the disastrous candidate has any chance of winning and so on, then you have a duty to vote on the basis of the kind of argument that Parfit gives. But for many voters in many elections, these conditions will not obtain. Okay, so a different way to defend the beneficence argument is suggested by Goldman in his article, Why Citizens Should Vote, a Causal Responsibility Approach. Goldman's suggestion is that the critic of voting here is assuming the wrong analysis of causality. So the critic's complaint is that, well, my vote won't make a difference to the outcome, right? And then surely what it means to make a difference to something is to have a causal influence on it. But in this sense, the critic of voting seems to be assuming a simple counterfactual analysis of causality, according to which C causes E, just in case if C had not happened, E would not have happened. My vote causes the candidate's victory just in case if I had not voted, the candidate would not have won. And obviously this condition basically never holds in an election. But the simple counterfactual analysis overlooks cases of causal overdetermination. Sometimes an event has more than one cause. Let's say you're in a firing squad of 10 people and you all shoot the prisoner, then it's not true that if you had not shot, the prisoner would not have died, because the prisoner would still have died from one of the other bullets. Yet we still take your shot as being one of the causes of the prisoner's death. Now obviously voting isn't really much like the firing squad case either, because your bullet alone would be enough to kill the prisoner, whereas your vote alone wouldn't be enough to win the election, at least assuming that there were other people who voted for the other party. So here Goldman introduces the notion of a vectorial causal system. In a vectorial causal system, changes in the system result from the interplay of forces that can be represented as vectors, so forces that have a particular magnitude and a particular direction. Think of a tug of war. Each person exerts a force on the rope in a particular direction, and the movement of the rope results from the sum of all of these forces. Let's say the rope moves left. Well, when we ask what caused the rope to move left, each person pulling left was a contributing factor in the production of the movement, while each person pulling right was a counteracting factor in the production of the movement, and each person just standing on the sidelines watching was a neutral factor. Goldman says that elections are vectorial causal systems like this. A vote for candidate X is a contributing factor in regard to X's election. A vote for a rival candidate is a counteracting factor in regards to X's election, and an abstention is a neutral factor in regards to X's election. If X wins, every vote for X is a partial cause of X's victory. Whereas neither a vote for a rival candidate nor an abstention are partial causes of X's victory. Every vote for X is a partial cause of X's victory because it's a contributing factor to it. So voting promotes the public good by making you a contributing factor to the election of the better candidate, or at least a counteracting factor to the election of the rival candidate. Now, one problem here is whether it makes sense to analyse elections in these terms. In a tug of war, all the forces are applied simultaneously, and that's not the case in an election where people vote at different times. What's more, since different constituencies will report the votes at different times, often the election will be decided before all of the votes have been counted. So it's not clear how those votes, the votes that come in after the election has already been decided, how they can be contributory factors in any sense. The election has already been won. Those votes haven't even come in. And even if we accept Goldman's model of elections here, we might object that he's just missing the point of the critic, because now the question becomes, well, why would there be a duty to be a contributing factor to a candidate's election, given that your contribution has a vanishingly small chance of actually changing the outcome? And it's not obvious how an analysis like Goldman's really addresses this problem. I mean, it seems like what Goldman is interested in doing is showing how a voter can be a partial cause of the candidate's election. But that doesn't exactly seem to be the issue that the critic of voting is concerned about. The point that the critic is making is, yeah, but your vote isn't going to change the outcome, right? That's the problem. Whether or not you're a cause, right? The point is you're not going to change the outcome, right? So why would there be a duty to vote, given that there's basically no chance of changing the outcome? It's not clear that the nature of causality really matters here. Right, a third defence of the duty to vote is that we're making a mistake in assuming that the goal of voting is to help a particular candidate win. Rather, you should vote in order that your favoured candidate wins by the largest margin or loses by the smallest margin. How much a candidate wins by is called the mandate of the candidate. Now, it's true that your vote is very unlikely to determine the winner, but your vote will increase or decrease the mandate of the winner. Now, it's worth noting that I think this is how many people actually treat elections. A landslide victory is often seen as being better than a mere victory. And sometimes a loss can seem positive if it's not as bad as people were expecting. In the 2017 UK general election, everybody was expecting Labour to be crushed. Their performance in the polls had been very, very bad in the weeks leading up to the election. Now, in the event, Labour lost, but they increased their share of the seats. So many people actually interpreted this as a good sign for Labour. Many people interpreted this as a kind of victory. Even though they technically lost, they gained a greater share of the votes than people were expecting. Okay then, so why then should we care about the mandate? Well, many people assume that an elected official's efficiency depends on their mandate. An official who has a bigger mandate, who has a larger share of the votes, will be better at getting things done and enacting their policies. Or if your candidate loses, they will make a more effective opposition the more votes they have. So this is why you should vote, because yes, your vote will not determine the winner, but your vote will increase or decrease the mandate of the winner, and that will have an effect on the winner's efficiency. Now, the main problem here, and this is discussed in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on the ethics and rationality of voting, is that political scientists now widely reject the hypothesis that the mandate of a party makes a difference to their efficiency. See, for example, Dahl's article, The Myth of the Presidential Mandate. The ability of a party to enact their policies doesn't seem to depend on how much they win by. All they need to do is win. But in any case, even if the mandate hypothesis were true, we run into the problem that your contribution to the mandate is extremely small. It's imperceptible. If your goal is to help your favoured candidate win, then the worry is that your vote will almost certainly make no difference. If the goal is to increase your favoured candidate's mandate, well, your vote will make a difference, but the difference will be utterly negligible. So again, why bother voting? It seems like there are far more useful things you could be doing with your time. Why would you have a duty to do something that's going to make an utterly negligible difference? Now, I mean, one response to this obviously is to say, well, imperceptible benefits, negligible benefits still matter. If I'm learning a guitar, for instance, I might want to become an expert guitarist. One day of practice will make only an imperceptible advancement towards that goal. I won't be noticeably better after only one day of practice. But you wouldn't say, oh, well, therefore you should just skip every day of practice, right? Of course not. So in the same way, we shouldn't dismiss the imperceptible benefit of voting. All right, then, a final defence of the instrumental value of voting was suggested by Anthony Downs, and this is the saving democracy argument. We want to live under a stable democratic government, but democracy only works provided enough people turn up to vote. Failing to vote will tend to undermine and weaken democracy. I guess the thought here is that as fewer people vote, the government will be maybe less responsive to the people, will have less reasons to care about the interests of the people. So even though your vote may not make a difference to the outcome, it will do a small part to help preserve democracy and good government. High voter turnout keeps the government attentive to the people. Now, obviously, this runs into the same problem as the mandate argument in that it makes very little difference if you personally abstain from voting. I mean, it makes a negligible difference because you're just one person. But there's a deeper problem here, which is why exactly should we want society to be more democratic in this sense? I mean, the argument assumes that if the proportion of voters were to get too small, democracy would be undermined. But that's not entirely obvious. So consider one way to make society more democratic would be to hold a general election every day. Nobody thinks that we need to do this, right? It's fine for general elections to be held really relatively rarely, once every few years. So similarly then, why would the quality of democracy be a function of the proportion of eligible voters who actually vote? Arguably, what keeps governments honest is not the fact that citizens do vote, but the fact that they could vote. So, if you suppose that only 20% of eligible voters were to exercise their right to vote, well, the point is that if things were to get particularly bad, the other 80% could exercise their right. It's that alone is enough to sort of preserve democracy. So, maybe that's a problem for this argument. So I just want to mention a very general problem for all attempts to kind of defend the beneficence argument. Let's suppose that the premises of the beneficence argument are right. Let's grant that you ought to act so as to promote the public good and that voting would promote the public good. This doesn't show that there's a duty to vote, because there are lots of other ways to promote the public good. So why would you have to engage in voting specifically, right? You can accept that, yes, we have to promote the public good, and voting is one way of promoting the public good, but that doesn't show that you have a duty to vote. It just says you've got to do something, right? You've got to do something to promote the public good. Like, I don't know, making detailed videos on philosophy available to anybody for free without any material rewards for yourself. That promotes the public good, probably more so than voting, actually. It probably has more of an effect than going out and voting would. There are things There are even things other than voting that will achieve the same type of benefits as voting, such as encouraging other people to vote. So if you manage to persuade just 2 people to vote, then that has achieved more than the person who casts 1 vote but doesn't try to influence others. So I mean, the most that the beneficence argument shows is that voting would be a good thing to do, but it may be supererogatory. It may go above and beyond our moral duties. And so any kind of defence of premise 2 of the beneficence argument, we might be able to show that voting promotes the public good, but actually that doesn't show that there's a duty to vote. With this in mind, is there any way to justify a duty to vote without appealing to the instrumental value of voting? Well, another argument for a duty to vote is sometimes called the generalization argument. And it goes like this. What would happen if nobody voted? Well, democracy would collapse. So you should vote because if nobody voted, we'd have no democracy. Obviously, democracy is worth preserving. I mean, maybe the thought here, I mean, that's a very, I suppose, simple way of putting it. But one way to spell it out might be to make a kind of Kantian argument. Kant would say that you should not act according to any principle that you cannot will to become a universal law. So the principles that guide your behaviour have to be principles that you would be okay with everybody following. For example, suppose you consider behaving according to the principle that whenever you need money, you will borrow some with the promise to return it without any intention of ever actually returning it. Well, if everybody followed this principle, they would constantly be making false promises, and the very convention of making promises and lending money would collapse, and you wouldn't like that. So it would be morally wrong to live by this principle. This is not a principle that you want anyone else to live by, so it would be morally wrong for you to live by it. In the same way, then, if everybody lived according to a principle like, I don't know, vote it only if it involves no sacrifice of your own interests or something like that, there would be no voters and so no democracy. But the main issue with this kind of argument is that it seems to be too general. What if nobody worked in farming? Then no food would be produced and we would all starve. What if nobody worked in water treatment? Then we would have no clean water. Obviously, these facts don't compel us to all do farming and water treatment work. Another issue with this is that it surely would depend on the reasons why I don't vote. So I may have specific reasons for not voting. I may not vote because I disagree strongly with all the parties that have any chance of winning, and I feel it would be pointless to vote for a guaranteed loss. And this principle, actually, this kind of reason can be generalized. If people with unusual political views stopped voting, democracy wouldn't collapse. Let's say somebody's a libertarian and they don't vote because none of the parties have a sufficiently libertarian platform. Well, it would be no problem if everybody followed that principle. If everybody followed the principle that if you're a libertarian and none of the parties have a sufficiently libertarian platform, then don't vote. Democracy would be fine. There would still be enough voters. But maybe a way to develop the kind of intuition, perhaps, behind this generalization argument is the free rider argument. I assume we all agree that being a free rider on the efforts of others is morally bad. For example, the state provides various public goods, such as roads, and these public goods are of enormous benefit to all of us, including me. These goods are supported by taxes. Now, I might reason like this. I might say, well, my taxes make a negligible contribution. Nothing would really change if I stopped paying my taxes. Roads wouldn't get any worse if just one person stopped paying their taxes. So I decide to refrain from paying taxes. And let's just suppose that I'm in no danger of punishment. I'm very, very good at avoiding tax. Well, now I'm a free rider. I'm enjoying the goods without paying my fair share. So the free riding argument goes like this. A properly functioning democracy is a public good from which we all benefit. People need to vote in order for there to be a democracy. There have to be at least some voters. It's immoral for you to be a free rider on the provision of public goods. So if you benefit from a public good, you should do your fair share in preserving it. Abstaining from voting is free riding, so it's immoral. So as with the previous generalization argument, we might worry whether this kind of reasoning applies too broadly, because in many cases it is fine to abstain from taking part in a practice that is a public good. Recall the farmer example. I benefit from some people being farmers without being a farmer myself. But the thing is, I'm not a free rider here. I'm not stealing the food, I'm buying the food, and the farmers are provided with compensation for their efforts. Indeed, by refraining from farming, whilst buying food produced by farmers, I contribute to the demand for farmers. Fewer farmers, so if you're in a situation where there are fewer farmers but there are more people buying the food from farmers, that creates an incentive for more people to take up farming, because the fewer farmers there are, the more that each farmer can charge for his or her products. So you're certainly not being a free rider in buying the food from farmers while not being a farmer yourself. That helps farmers. The question is then, is voting more like paying your taxes or more like being a farmer? Well, I mean, in general, if I benefit from an activity performed by others, how do I know whether or not I'm a free rider? If I never paid taxes, that would impose a greater burden on other taxpayers to maintain the current quality of the public goods. It would only incrementally, right? It would be negligible, but a negligible harm is still a harm. On the other hand, if I stop farming, that doesn't impose a greater burden on other farmers. Indeed, as I've said, it benefits them by reducing competition. So, if I abstain from voting, does that impose a greater burden on others? Well, arguably not. Each person gets one vote, after all, right? Whether or not I vote makes absolutely no difference to that. I mean, it's not as if I abstain from voting, then somebody else will have to vote twice. No, it's one person, one vote. Indeed, arguably, my abstention benefits others because it reduces electoral competition. If I abstain from voting, your vote counts for more. It has more impact. There's more chance of your vote making a difference. It's only negligibly more chance, but still, right? A negligible benefit is still a benefit. So maybe the free rider argument, again, maybe that doesn't quite work. A final issue that maybe is just worth noting about both the generalization argument and this specific free rider argument is that it's not at all clear that it would be a bad thing if nobody voted. Now, it's true, if there were no voters, there would be no democracy. And obviously, when we imagine non-democratic systems, we usually think of authoritarian, repressive systems. So we naturally assume that no voters means something like an authoritarian dictatorship. But that's not what we're supposed to imagine here, right? So in the scenario under consideration, people have the right to vote, but they choose not to. So this is a system where the population is no longer interested in politics, where it just doesn't matter to anybody which candidate wins. Each candidate maybe will do just as good a job as another. Whether this would be a good or a bad society depends on how we spell out the situation. Maybe nobody votes because everything is just so good for everybody, and there's no danger that any candidate will screw it up. So it's not clear that even the sort of intuition behind the generalization argument, this idea that, well, if nobody voted, then there would be no democracy, and that would be a really bad thing. It's not obvious how to kind of evaluate that. Okay, a final way to defend the moral duties of vote is to argue that voting is fundamentally a kind of expressive act. So this is the expressive theory of voting, that citizens vote not just to affect government policy, but also to express themselves. Not all of our acts are designed to bring about some positive instrumental consequence. We engage in all kinds of expressive activity, which we use to build our identity, to signal our values, to align ourselves with a particular community or particular movement. And furthermore, we judge people as morally blameworthy for failing to engage in particular kinds of expression. Think about something like sending a card to a hospitalized friend. You don't expect this to improve therapeutic outcome. It's just an expression of support. And arguably, as a friend, you have a moral duty to express such support. If you failed to do so, you'd be blameworthy. We would judge that you're not a good friend. Or think about something like standing in the 2-minute silence on Remembrance Day. as a citizen of the country, you have a responsibility to express respect for those who sacrifice their lives defending the country. Similarly then, the thought is that as a citizen of democracy, you have a responsibility to take part in elections in order to express support for the democratic process. Democracy is a very important enterprise which benefits us all. It's a way of making government responsive to the needs of the people rather than just the few. And of course, it wasn't just gifted to us by the powerful. People had to struggle for centuries to attain democracy. Now, by refusing to vote, you express that you're just unconcerned with all of this. It can go on without you. It doesn't matter to you. You can't be bothered to take 10 minutes out of your day to show your support. That's a vicious attitude to take towards a very important matter like democracy. And I'm sure you're familiar with that if somebody says they're not going to vote, then somebody else will respond, but people fought and died for your ability to vote. Voting is this socially significant ritual that we use to express our assent to the legitimacy of democracy and to honour those who fought for it. So failing to vote is like failing to stand in the 2-minute silence on Remembrance Day. So one question about this is whether we really do have a moral duty to take part in expressive acts like this in general. So with the 2-minute silence on Remembrance Day, if I'm in a public place where everybody else is observing the silence and then I just start screaming and shouting in order to disrupt them, then yes, that would obviously be very disrespectful. But what if I just stay at home and ignore it and just do other things, right? That's fine, surely. There doesn't seem to be a duty to participate in the 2-minute silence. It's just that, if you're somewhere where people are participating, then you shouldn't disrupt them. So again, it's not really obvious why there would be a duty to participate in voting. Furthermore, it's questionable whether people actually do view voting as an expressive act in this kind of sense. After all, voting is done in secret and it's completely anonymous, so you're not actually expressing anything to anybody. You can express your political allegiances much more effectively by putting up flyers, putting up flags, engaging in political debates, going to political events and so on. And the expressive view of voting also has difficulty accounting for the popularity of tactical voting. Many people will vote for a party they dislike just to block what they perceive as the worst party. So they will suppress their own preferences and their own values. If we used voting as a means of expressing our values and our commitment to a particular type of political system, tactical voting would seem not to make much sense. Okay then, so we've looked at some of the arguments for the view that there is a moral duty to vote. So as I hope we've seen, although that is a common piece of folk morality, it's not entirely obvious what the justification for the duty to vote might be. Now, before we end, I want to consider an argument for the claim that actually many of us have a duty not to vote. So not only is there no duty to vote, there's actually a positive duty not to vote. And this argument is given by Jason Brennan in his Ethics of Voting book, also in his article Polluting the Polls. What's the argument here? Well, first of all, it seems pretty plausible to say that people can vote badly. Now, even if you think that there's a moral duty to vote, you probably want to say that people should at least vote well. Not just any vote is acceptable. I might know that some policy would be really bad for society as a whole, but good for me, and then I vote selfishly to improve my lot at the cost of others. Like if I were to vote for the pro-slavery party, very few people would think that that's an acceptable thing to do. Now, the good news is that political scientists have found that people tend to vote for what they perceive to be in the national interest, not purely self-interest, or at least so says Brennan. The problem is that people are often wrong about what would be in the national interest. The majority of people are ignorant and irrational, and they make systematic errors that lead them to support bad policies. And that goes for many of us who think that we are well educated, because expertise in one area doesn't translate well to expertise in another. You may be a great chemist, a great doctor, a great philosopher. Doesn't make you a good judge of who would be best to run the country. Many of us have strong political opinions without having done anywhere near enough studying to justify our opinions. So many of us vote badly, not out of selfishness, but out of negligence. So just a couple of examples that Brennan cites here. There's a substantial consensus among economists that free trade promotes economic growth and tends to increase standards of living. Protectionist policies like tariffs and import quotas that restrict the import of goods from foreign countries are widely rejected by economists. Yet there's often great support among the population for protectionist policies, often on the grounds that such policies are required in order to protect native industries from foreign competition. What's striking about this isn't just that the majority of people draw what many economists would regard as the wrong conclusion about free trade. It's that actually most people aren't even aware of the economic consensus on this. People are, they're just ignorant. Another example that Brennan gives is that there's a consensus among economists that the government should not use price controls to curb inflation. But again, there's often support for price controls among non-economists. So, Brennan thinks that the average voter is just almost totally ignorant about the relevant issues, and this often leads to bad policies because political parties need to target their policies to the average voter. Now, Brennan says abstaining is better than voting badly. Bad votes lead to bad policies, and that hurts everybody. But the ignorant and the irrational will make bad votes because they have no way of telling what the right vote will be. So, if you're not sufficiently well informed, you ought to abstain. You ought not to, as Brennan puts it, pollute the polls with a bad vote. Bad voters pollute the polls, whereas abstainers have no effect. Now, it's important to stress that Brennan accepts that everybody should have the right to vote, or at least he accepts this in the Ethics of Voting book, though he's actually done later, he wrote a later book where he questions this. But the point is, this argument is just about whether you should exercise the right to vote. Everybody should have the right, but morally, not everybody should exercise it. The ignorant and the irrational and the badly informed should not exercise it. Now, we often think of abstaining as relinquishing political power. But Brennan argues that for those of us who are ignorant, abstention will be the most efficient way of exercising political power. He gives the example that as a member of a club, you may be asked to vote on issues that you don't understand or where you know you're prone to error. You want to do the right thing and make sure that the best policy for the club is enacted. In this case, the best way to use your power as an eligible voter is to abstain. You haven't relinquished your power, you've exercised your power in a particular kind of way. You've permitted others to make the decision because you recognise that you don't have sufficient knowledge to make a good decision. So what gives you political power is the right to vote, not simply the exercise of that right. In general, you have power by having the right to make decisions. A woman has power over her own body by having the right to have an abortion. She doesn't relinquish power by choosing not to have an abortion. She exercises her power in a particular way. Brennan says that abstaining is similarly an exercise of political power. It's an expression of your will that the best outcome be achieved, but with an acknowledgement that you just don't have the knowledge, the understanding to judge what the best outcome would be. So, many of us ought not to vote. Unless you are well educated about, political theory and economics and so on, you should abstain. So, is Brennan's argument convincing? Well, just like many arguments for the duty to vote, Brennan's argument faces the problem that a single vote won't make any difference. So, in this case, the problem is it won't make any difference, so it can't do any harm. And why would you have a duty not to do something that really isn't going to make a difference or anything, that isn't going to do any harm? The problems of voting only arise because so many ignorant, irrational people vote, and there's nothing I can do to change that. Even if I don't vote, millions of ignorant, irrational people will continue to do so, and my vote makes no difference to that. Indeed, the expected harm of driving to the polling station through the chance of car crashes must be greater than the expected harm of voting. Now, from Brennan's point of view, voting is a kind of collective action problem. We would all be far better off if far fewer ignorant, irrational people voted. But if one ignorant, irrational person stops voting, that's not going to make a difference. So in the case of collective action problems, what does morality require? Well, Take a classic tragedy of the commons scenario. The Tongan Island coral reefs are collectively held with no restrictions on access. Recently, fishermen have begun bleach fishing, which is a technique that yields a large harvest of fish in the short term, but will destroy the reef in the longer term. Now consider an individual fisherman whose livelihood depends on the reef. Brennan suggests that he's permitted to use the bleach fishing technique because, well, this is his livelihood. It's his only way to feed his children. It's okay, or at least it's excusable, for him to contribute to the problem because there's a high cost of refraining. If he doesn't use this technique, he's going to starve. So, even though it contributes to the problem, we can excuse it. In contrast, let's say that everybody in my town is littering. I can easily refrain from littering, and it seems that I should, even though this won't actually solve the problem or even make much difference. If everybody's littering, then one person refraining from littering won't do much to help, but still I should refrain. Because even though my littering is a minor, even imperceptible contribution to the overall problem, I can avoid it at no cost to myself. So the claim then is, you have a duty to avoid being part of the problem when you can do so at little or no personal cost. And that's the case for voting. You can refrain from voting at low personal cost. Indeed, if anything, you get a minor benefit because it's more fun to just stay at home than to go to the polls. To cast a vote when you recognise that you are ignorant and and not well informed, that's like littering. Just because lots of other people do it doesn't make it okay for you to do it too. You can refrain from this bad thing at very little personal cost, so you should do. Even though your single vote won't make any difference, or at least it will make very little difference, you should still refrain from it. You still have a duty not to do it, according to Brennan. A second problem for Brennan's argument is the moral disenfranchisement of minorities. The groups of people who are least educated, so would have to abstain, on Brennan's view, tend to be those who are otherwise disadvantaged. They tend to be the poor, the minorities. one result of discrimination and oppression is that the victims will not have had so many educational opportunities. And obviously, if you're really poor, if you're struggling to feed your family, you're not going to have time to educate yourself on economic theory. On Brennan's view, it seems that it will be mostly people who are already disadvantaged who have a moral obligation to abstain from voting. But isn't that rather repugnant? He's saying that society's policies should be determined by groups who already yield greater power. Now, actually, Brennan basically just accepts this point. He says that, yes, it's true that minorities have been badly served, and so we should favour policies that will promote better education and more opportunity for minorities, but it doesn't follow that they should vote at the same rates as other groups. If it is true, for example, that poor black people tend to be less politically well-informed than rich white people, then more black people should abstain from voting. Discrimination has many bad consequences. Perhaps if a minority group had received adequate education and the right opportunities, more of them would have become surgeons or lawyers. Maybe as a result of discrimination, white people have had an unfair advantage over black people in this respect. So there are sort of more a greater proportion of white surgeons and lawyers than there really should be. And so, if this is the case, if white people have, as a result of discrimination, had an unfair advantage, that's a bad thing. And, we should take steps to try to fix that. But we wouldn't try to solve this injustice by having unqualified black people work as surgeons or lawyers. And so similarly, people who are ignorant and irrational about political matters would be bad voters, and so they shouldn't vote. If poor minority groups are overwhelmingly ignorant and irrational about politics as a result of discrimination, then yes, we should try to improve their lot, but it doesn't mean that they morally should vote. They'd still be bad voters. They'd end up, making bad decisions, not just for the country, but for themselves. If you're not well informed, you don't know what kind of policies would improve your status. And now, one obvious worry about this kind of response, something that Brennan doesn't really seem to address, is, how exactly is the situation of a minority group going to change if indeed they don't vote. Now, if a particular group tends to abstain from voting, then won't the government be less likely to pay attention to them, less likely to give consideration to their needs? I mean, in theory, the educated experts could speak up for minority communities, but in practice, while I'm sure some educated experts would speak up for minorities, many of them will just focus on other things. And I think people inevitably tend to sort of only, people tend to be sort of more aware of the kinds of problems that affect themselves, don't they? It just seems likely that if minority groups were to tend to stop voting, well, their voices wouldn't be heard, their concerns maybe would be less likely to be addressed. So that might be a concern. Okay, another objection to Brennan's argument is that it seems that it's just not feasible for anybody to achieve the level of knowledge that he requires in order to be a voter. When you vote in a general election, at least, you're voting for which parties should run the whole country. The trouble is, there's no possible way you could develop an expertise on all the different things relevant to running a country. What should we do with respect to military defence, the police force, the benefit system, the NHS, cybercrime, public transport, social housing, international trade, taxation rates, etc. Even if you're well educated on some areas, you'll be ignorant in other respects. Brennan himself focuses a lot on economics. Like his examples of the ways in which people are very ignorant are drawn from economics, but that's only like one kind of area that you need to be thinking about if you're thinking about how to run a country. And even within economics, I would assume, I don't actually know much about it, but presumably there are lots of different kind of subfields of economics, and being an expert in one doesn't necessarily make you an expert in another. There just isn't enough time in your life to become an expert about everything. So I guess there's a question here about what kind of level of knowledge do we really need? Do we need expertise? Or is it enough to have something less than that? Okay, a final worry about Brennan's argument. The Dunning-Kruger effect is pretty well established in psychology. People who are incompetent with respect to a particular field often significantly overestimate their ability in that field, and they often take themselves to be competent. They are unaware of their own ignorance. Which means, if people accepted Brennan's argument, the ignorant people would not be aware of their own ignorance, so they would carry on voting, generally speaking. By contrast, people who are competent and well-educated in a particular field often underestimate their own abilities. Part of this is just because as you become better educated about a field, you also start to realise just how much of the field you still have left to learn. You start to, you know enough to know just how much you don't know. And so you kind of feel like you're maybe not as competent as you are. Many of these people will take themselves to be ignorant and will refrain from voting. So paradoxically, if people were to accept Brennan's argument, this might actually result in a less informed electorate, a higher proportion of ignorant voters, because the ignorant people, being sure of themselves, would carry on voting. The educated, who know enough to know just how much they still don't know, who are less sure of their own abilities, would abstain. Even if you accept everything Brennan says, it might be a good idea not to promote his argument. There's almost perhaps practical, undermines itself, let's say, practically self-undermining. Okay then, well that's all I wanted to talk about today, so thanks for watching, goodbye.